I never thought his touch would linger. Never imagined my breath would hitch in my throat the way it did. But it happened, and now I can't erase that moment in Greenfield Park from my mind. Mark had disappeared again, off to some emergency business meeting. He barely glanced at me when he left, his tie askew, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. I stood there in the kitchen, feeling like a faded version of the woman I used to be. The silence in our house felt suffocating, pressing in from every side. Too much space, too much loneliness. So when Josh, my stepson, shuffled into the living room, I grabbed my jacket without a second thought. "Let's go out," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Josh raised an eyebrow, momentarily looking up from his phone. "Where?" "Anywhere but here. Let's drive." He hesitated, then shrugged. When I opened the front door, he followed. The drive to the park felt like holding my breath underwater. Josh sat slouched in the passenger seat, headphones hanging around his neck, scrolling mindlessly. The city blurred past us, autumn leaves swirling on the pavement. I pulled into a parking spot, crooked but uncaring. "Come on," I said, stepping out. The sun was relentless, pouring through the trees, casting golden streaks across the grass. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of the pond. Families bustled around us, kids giggling, joggers moving past, couples lost in conversation. It was a stark contrast to the void I felt whenever I thought about my marriage. We wandered along the path, Josh walking a few steps behind, hands shoved into his pockets. He'd grown so much over the past year, broader shoulders and easy stride. Sometimes I caught myself forgetting he was still just a teenager. "I need a break," I said, nodding toward a bench near the pond. The wood was sun-warmed beneath my fingers as I sat. Josh plopped down beside me, stretching his legs out. "You've been acting weird lately," he muttered, eyes still fixed on his phone. I tensed. "What?" He sighed, finally looking at me. "You just seem different." His bluntness took me off guard. "I'm fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. Josh studied me, his gaze steady. "You don't look fine." Something in his expression made my stomach twist. It wasn't just concern, it was deeper, something almost protective. "I'm just tired," I murmured, staring at the water. "Tired of Mark?" His words hit like a punch. I sucked in a sharp breath. "Josh, you don't have to lie," he said, elbows resting on his knees. "I see it. He's always gone. He barely talks to you. It's not fair." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him it wasn't that simple. But the words tangled in my throat. How could he see so clearly what I'd been trying to deny for years? Silence stretched between us, thick with something unspoken. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he said finally, softer this time. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. Josh nodded, his gaze lingering on mine a beat too long. My heart skipped. I shot up from the bench. We should head back. The walk to the car felt heavier. Each accidental brush of his shoulder sent a current through me I couldn't explain. The drive home was almost unbearably quiet. Josh stared out the window, jaw tight. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. When we pulled into the driveway, Mark's car was nowhere to be seen. Of course. Josh climbed out, heading upstairs without another word. I lingered in the doorway, pulse hammering for reasons I refused to name. I stayed in the kitchen long after, staring at the empty coffee mug Mark had left behind. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Something had shifted in that park, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. And as much as I tried to suppress it, I knew there was no undoing what had begun. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just a passing moment, a trick of the mind. But when I closed my eyes that night, I could still feel it, his gaze, his words, the weight of something unspoken lingering between us. The next morning, I busied myself with routine. Dishes, laundry, anything to fill the silence. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the air in the house felt different. Josh was in the living room, sprawled across the couch, flipping through his phone. The sunlight poured in through the window, catching the strands of his messy brown hair. He looked up when I walked past. "Hey," he said casually. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice even. He studied me for a second too long, like he was searching for something. Then, as if shaking off the thought, he looked back at his phone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned toward the kitchen. "Need help with anything?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Josh never volunteered to help. Sure," I said, glancing over my shoulder. "Could you grab the dishes from the dining table?" He got up without hesitation, moving past me. His arm brushed mine, light as a feather, but enough to send a current through my skin. I froze for half a second before shaking it off. "It's nothing." But then, as I reached for a glass, my hand slipped, sending it tumbling into the sink with a loud clatter. "You okay?" Josh was right behind me now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. "Yeah," I breathed, forcing a shaky laugh. "Just clumsy today." He didn't move. I turned to face him, and for a split second, neither of us spoke. The house was too quiet, the air too thick, and I swore I could hear the faintest hitch in his breath. Then he blinked, breaking the moment, and took a step back. "I'll just get the dishes," he mumbled, turning away. I nodded quickly, swallowing hard. It was fine. Everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The tension didn't fade. If anything, it thickened, stretching between us like an unspoken truth neither of us wanted to name. That evening, I stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables, trying to focus on the steady rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. The kitchen smelled of fresh basil and garlic, but I barely noticed. My mind was elsewhere. Mark had sent a text, working late again, just 4 words, cold and routine. "No explanation, no apology." I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked my phone and placed it face down on the counter. Footsteps approached.
"Josh."
He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me for a beat before speaking. "Want me to help?" His voice was casual, but there was something beneath it, something unreadable. I hesitated for half a second, then nodded.
"Yeah."
"Can you set the table?" He stepped forward, moving past me toward the cabinet. As he reached up for the plates, his arm brushed against my shoulder, not an accident, not forceful, just there. His warmth bled through the fabric of my sweater, and I felt my pulse skip. I exhaled sharply, gripping the knife tighter. Josh noticed. "You okay?" I forced a small laugh, shaking my head like I could brush it all off. "Yeah, just distracted." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he lingered, his presence impossible to ignore. I felt the weight of his gaze on me as I sliced through a tomato, the blade slipping slightly, nearly nicking my finger. Josh reached out instinctively, his fingers closing lightly around my wrist. "Careful," he murmured. For a second, we didn't move. The house was too quiet. No TV in the background. No noise from the street. Just us, standing too close in a space that suddenly felt too small. His grip wasn't tight, but I was acutely aware of the warmth of his fingers against my skin. It sent a ripple through me, something unsteady, something unfamiliar. I pulled my hand back first. "Thanks," I muttered, wiping my hands on a towel. Josh nodded, his jaw tensing for the briefest moment before he turned away, gathering the plates and setting them on the table. I swallowed hard, picking up my phone again. The screen was still dark. No new messages. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just a weird moment, a product of loneliness and exhaustion. But I knew better. Josh wasn't a kid anymore, and the way he looked at me wasn't how a stepson should look at his stepmother. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. The clink of forks against plates was the only sound filling the room. Josh sat across from me, his head slightly bowed, pushing his food around with his fork more than eating. His shoulders were tense, and I could tell he was lost in thought. Mark's absence loomed over the table like a shadow. I used to make excuses for it, pretend his workaholic tendencies were just a phase, that someday he'd come home early, ask about my day, sit down and actually listen. But years had passed, and the excuses had run dry. Josh finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "You're not eating." I blinked, realizing I'd barely touched my food. "Just not hungry." He frowned, setting his fork down. "You sure you're okay?" The question felt heavier than it should have. Maybe it was the way he asked it, genuine, like he wasn't just making conversation, like he actually cared about the answer. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just a long day." Josh didn't look convinced. His fingers tapped lightly against the table, a quiet, rhythmic sound that made my nerves prickle. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You shouldn't have to be alone all the time." My breath hitched. The way he said it, it wasn't casual. It wasn't empty sympathy. I set my fork down slowly. "Josh." He shook his head. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Never mind." He picked up his plate and stood, taking it to the sink without another word. The muscles in his back were tense as he rinsed it off, his jaw set tight. I sat there, staring at my untouched food, trying to process what just happened.
He was right.
I was alone, but hearing him say it out loud, like he could see straight through me, made my stomach twist. When he turned around, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me. "You deserve better." A lump formed in my throat. I should have shut it down, laughed it off, told him he was being dramatic. But I didn't. Instead, I looked away, my hands gripping the edges of my chair. "We shouldn't be having this conversation." Josh studied me for a moment before nodding, pushing away from the counter. "Yeah," he murmured. "You're right." And then, without another word, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me sitting there with my pulse racing and my thoughts spinning out of control. I knew, in that moment, that whatever was happening between us wasn't just in my head. And that scared me more than anything. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was imagining things, twisting innocent moments into something they weren't. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. The sky was gray, the house unusually quiet. Mark had left early, no note, no message. Not that I expected one. I went downstairs, wrapping myself in my robe, craving the comfort of coffee. The smell of it filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, but the unease from the night before still clung to me. Josh was already there. He sat at the table, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug, the other scrolling absent-mindedly on his phone. His hair was slightly damp, like he'd just showered, and his hoodie hung loose over his frame. He looked up when I entered, his eyes lingering on me for a second too long. "Morning." "Morning," I murmured, pouring myself a cup. I kept my focus on the coffee, as if staring at the swirling liquid would ground me somehow. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, but charged. I sat across from him, bringing the mug to my lips, desperate to keep my hands busy. I should have said something about the night before, about the way he looked at me, about the words that had passed between us. But I didn't. Instead, Josh set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. "You have plans today?" I shook my head. "Not really." He hesitated, fingers tapping against the ceramic mug. Then, with careful nonchalance, he said, "We could go out. Get out of the house for a while." I glanced at him. "Go where?" Josh shrugged. "Anywhere. Just somewhere that isn't here." It was a bad idea. I knew that immediately. But the alternative, sitting in this empty house, letting my thoughts fester, felt worse. "Okay," I said before I could stop myself. Josh's lips twitched, almost like he was surprised I agreed so easily.
"Cool.
"I'll drive." I nodded, finishing my coffee in a few quick sips. I told myself this was fine, that it was harmless, that it was nothing. But as I walked back upstairs to get dressed, I felt his eyes on me. And the way my skin tingled under his gaze told me I was lying to myself. The drive was quiet at first. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving streaks on the windshield as Josh guided the car through slick streets. The air inside was warm, filled with the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the lingering coffee from our kitchen. I told myself this was normal. Just a simple outing, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the awareness of him beside me. The way his fingers tapped idly against the steering wheel, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly when I shifted in my seat. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, my voice softer than I intended. Josh glanced at me, one corner of his mouth twitching up. "You'll see." Minutes passed. The buildings thinned out, replaced by open roads and trees glistening with leftover rain. Then, he turned onto a familiar path, one I hadn't been down in years. Greenfield Lake. I exhaled sharply, caught off guard. Josh pulled into the gravel lot and put the car in park, resting his hands on the wheel for a second before finally looking at me. "You used to bring me here when I was younger." I swallowed. "I did." "I remember," he murmured, his gaze steady. "You'd pack a picnic. We'd sit near the water for hours." I smiled faintly, the memory surfacing. Back when things were simpler. Before life became something to endure instead of something to enjoy. Josh shifted, resting his arm against the back of his seat. "Figured you could use some fresh air." I hesitated. "Josh." "What?" "This feels like something it shouldn't." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "And what does it feel like?" I couldn't answer. I didn't have the words. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not trying to make things weird. I hate seeing you like this. You act like everything's fine, but I see it. You're not happy." The words hit deeper than they should have. I turned, staring out at the lake, at the way the water rippled under the cloudy sky. He's right. I'm not happy. But that's not his burden to carry. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. Josh let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Right." I reached for the door handle. "I need some air." Before he could respond, I stepped out of the car, the cool breeze hitting my skin instantly. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm and endless, like it held secrets I wasn't ready to face. A few seconds later, I heard the car door shut behind me. Josh came to stand beside me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. We stood there in silence, the space between us charged with everything we weren't saying. And I was terrified of what might happen if one of us finally did. The wind off the lake was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I hugged my arms around myself, staring at the water, watching ripples form where the rain had touched its surface. Josh stood beside me, silent. But his presence was heavy, charged. I forced a breath. "You didn't have to bring me here." "I wanted to." His voice was calm, steady. I turned to face him. "Josh, whatever this is, it can't happen." Something flickered across his face, gone too fast for me to read. He nodded slowly, but there was no real agreement in the motion. "I know," he said. But he didn't step away. I swallowed, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something dangerous and irreversible. I should have moved, put distance between us, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, caught in the way his gaze settled on mine, unwavering. "You deserve more than this," he murmured, voice barely above the wind. "More than being ignored. More than waiting around for someone who doesn't even see you." My throat tightened. "Josh." He reached up, brushing a damp strand of hair from my face. The touch was brief, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver through me. I closed my eyes for half a second, willing my pulse to slow, to make this moment disappear. But when I opened them, he was still there, watching me, waiting. I took a step back, shaking my head. "This isn't right." Josh exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know." And yet neither of us moved. The silence between us stretched, thick with everything we weren't saying. Then, finally, Josh let out a low chuckle, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's go," he said, nodding toward the car. I didn't argue. The ride home was quieter than the drive there. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, watching the wet streets blur past. Josh didn't speak, and I didn't dare break the silence. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the sky had darkened, the air heavy with the promise of more rain. Josh put the car in park, but didn't move. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles tight. I reached for the door handle, hesitating. "Josh." "I meant what I said," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to keep pretending everything's okay." I inhaled sharply, my fingers tightening around the handle. "Good night, Josh." I stepped out before he could say anything else, my heart pounding harder than it should have. I didn't look back, but I felt his eyes on me the whole way inside. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again. The weight of Josh's gaze, the way the air between us had thickened, the way my pulse had jumped when his fingers brushed my skin. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of rain against the window. Mark was still at work. Or maybe he wasn't. I hadn't bothered to ask. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. But the moment morning came, the tension was still there, lingering like an unfinished sentence. By the time I went downstairs, Josh was already in the kitchen. He sat at the counter, flipping through his phone, a mug of coffee in front of him. He looked up when I entered, eyes lingering on me for just a moment too long before he spoke.
Morning.
"Morning," I murmured, moving past him toward the coffee pot. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I poured my coffee with steady hands, determined to act normal. "This is nothing. This is fine." Josh set his phone down. "You okay?" I exhaled slowly, forcing a small smile. Why wouldn't I be? He studied me for a moment, then shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "Right." I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I needed to say something, to draw a line before this thing, whatever it was, went any further. But before I could, he stood up. I froze as he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "I meant what I said last night." I swallowed hard. "Josh, we can't." "I know," he murmured, but he didn't move away. I forced myself to look at him. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. This was my moment to end it, to tell him this had to stop. But I didn't. Instead, I whispered, "Then act like it." For a second, neither of us moved. Then, finally, Josh exhaled sharply and took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "I'll be out for a while," he muttered, grabbing his keys from the counter. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The front door shut behind him a moment later, the sound echoing through the empty house. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, gripping the counter, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had drawn a line. So, why did it feel like I had just crossed one? The house was eerily quiet after Josh left. I stayed in the kitchen, fingers still curled around my coffee mug, staring at nothing. My pulse hadn't settled, my thoughts still tangled in knots I couldn't undo. I had told him to act like it. But wasn't I the one who needed to? I forced myself to move, to clean up, to fill the silence with the clatter of dishes and running water. Routine. That's what I needed. Something predictable, something that didn't make my skin prickle and my heart race. But routine didn't stop my mind from drifting back to last night, to the way he had looked at me, to the way I hadn't pulled away soon enough. I was still standing at the sink when I heard the front door open. My breath caught. I turned, expecting Josh, but it wasn't him. It was Mark. I blinked, caught off guard. "You're home early." He loosened his tie, setting his briefcase down by the door. Meeting got canceled. That was it. No warmth, no "I missed you," no acknowledgement that he had barely been home this week. He walked past me, heading straight for the fridge. There's no dinner? I swallowed back the sharp retort that nearly escaped. I didn't know you'd be home. Mark sighed, rubbing his temple like I was an inconvenience. I'll just order something. I watched him pull out his phone, scrolling through takeout options without so much as a glance in my direction. This was how it always was now, like we were just two people who existed in the same space, nothing more. I should have cared. Should have fought to fix things. Instead, I just turned away. Upstairs, I shut the door to my bedroom, pressing my forehead against the wood. I inhaled deeply, trying to shake the weight pressing down on my chest. Mark was home. Josh wasn't. And somehow that felt like the bigger problem. I changed into something comfortable, loose sweater, leggings, trying to ease the tension in my body. But when I passed by the mirror, I stopped. I looked different. Not in a way that could be explained by exhaustion or age. Different in a way that made me realize something had shifted. Something I wasn't sure I could take back. Hours passed, but I barely noticed. Mark was downstairs, absorbed in his own world, making calls, watching TV, existing without truly being present. I should have gone down. Should have tried to bridge the space between us. But instead, I stayed in my room, lost in the weight of everything that had unraveled over the past few days. The sky had darkened by the time I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway.
Josh.
I stayed frozen, listening as the front door opened, then shut. His footsteps were slow, hesitant. I could tell he was expecting the house to feel different. Maybe in some ways it was. A few minutes later, a soft knock at my bedroom door sent a jolt through me. I turned, pulse quickening. I shouldn't open it. I knew that. But I did. Josh stood in the doorway, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. The hallway light cast soft shadows across his face, making him look older, more certain. Neither of us spoke at first. Then finally he exhaled. Can we talk? I hesitated, gripping the doorframe. Josh, this has to stop. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't waver. I know. And yet he didn't leave. I swallowed hard, willing myself to be strong, to say the things that needed to be said. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was the truth. I don't know how. Josh took a step closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. His voice was low, careful. Then let me go. I stiffened, because I knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about leaving the hallway or walking away from this conversation. He was telling me to let him go before we crossed a line we could never uncross. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I could. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, my throat tightening. Josh. He shook his head, a small, sad smile touching his lips. It's okay, he murmured. I get it. And for the first time, I wondered if he really did. Because I didn't. I didn't understand how something so impossible had begun to feel inevitable. I didn't understand how I had let it come this far. All I knew was that if I didn't end it now, I never would. So I stepped back. I gripped the doorframe, knuckles white. Good night, Josh. A beat of silence. Then a slow nod. He turned, walking away, his footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. I watched him go, my chest aching with something I couldn't name. Then I shut the door. And this time, I locked it. Josh didn't move. Neither did I. The space between us was thick, charged, crackling like a live wire ready to snap. Tell me to leave, he murmured. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. His gaze searched mine, waiting, hoping for a reason to stop. I didn't give him one. Then, in one slow, inevitable moment, he reached for me. And I let him. I felt the warmth of his fingers, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the silent question hanging between us. The front door slammed downstairs. Mark was home. I ripped away, heart hammering. Josh froze, his jaw tightening. Footsteps in the hall. Panic surged through me.
Go, he whispered.
His eyes locked onto mine, burning, but he didn't argue. He turned, disappearing down the hall just as Mark's voice echoed from below. "Honey." I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady my breath. "Coming," I called, my voice barely holding steady. I stepped toward the door, stopped, closed my eyes, tried to pretend nothing had happened, tried to pretend I hadn't wanted it to. And then, with shaking hands, I went downstairs.